Hi, my name is Chris Panka, and I'm doing African American servants post Civil War in the 1960s. Think the help. So, to start off, I decided to just give a little bit of let's move this down here. To just give a little bit of background. 1863, so Lincoln announces the end of slavery. 1865, Congress and the states vote to change the Constitution to make slavery illegal. The North wins the war, and all the people that were enslaved in the South became free. So this is the beginning of what is called the Reconstruction in the South. And it's called the Reconstruction because the government was rebuilding the South after the Civil War. So some people left and many stayed. This is a 13-year-old sharecropper in the 1870s. A lot of people just went on picking cotton, honestly. They didn't own any land to farm, and if they tried to get land, they were attacked by white people. A lot of people kept on planting because they were sharecroppers now instead of slaves. So for a lot of people, it didn't make much difference. There weren't so many beatings anymore, and you didn't have your kids or husband taken away from you. But white people still terrified black people by killing them for nothing or almost nothing, and no white judge or jury in the South would send any white man to trial for killing a black man. White people often killed black people without a trial by lynching. We saw this in To Kill a Mockingbird. We saw it in Anatomy of a Murder. So this time period was basically slavery 2.0, slavery light, or neo-slavery. So the blacks who didn't move north just kept picking cotton until the boll weevil destroyed the industry in 1910. They were still subject to harassment, to lynching, etc. Some blacks tried to move west, but there were western states who made laws that prevented African Americans from moving there. Some people went back to Africa, and people who stayed in the United States tried to get the government to help blacks find work, such as Sojourner Truth, who was a large activist for black people's rights in the job industry, and proper wages and treatment, etc. Anything you would give a normal human being. So white people continue to be terrible. They wouldn't hire black folk for good jobs. So this created a niche for people of color as nannies, cooks, taking care of the sick, going to war, jobs people didn't really want to do. So that rode all the way into the 1960s because segregation is basically a way to keep a disenfranchised community disenfranchised. So something really interesting that I learned was about hidden slaves in the 1960s. So there was this woman who was published by Vice. She's a historian and genealogist. Her name is Antoinette Harrell. She uncovered long-hidden cases of blacks who were still living as slaves a century past the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. So her groundbreaking work exposed cases in Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, Florida. She started working over 20 years ago on this. In 1994, she was looking up her ancestors. Honestly, it started pretty innocently. And she tracked down freedmen contracts to verify that they were sharecroppers, and word spread around New Orleans, and she went to a number of speaking engagements. So at one of these engagements, she learned about hidden slavery in the 1960s. She recounts a woman who came up to her and told her that she personally knew a group of people who didn't get their freedom until the 1950s. So intrigued, Harrell accepted an invitation to her house, and they told the story, their story. So they became indebted to the plantation owner, and as a result could not leave the property. So at the end of every harvest year, their group was told they didn't make any profit, and they had to try again the next year. So this cycle kept them on the land, and some of the people were tied to that tract of land until the 1960s. It's really crazy. So there was a great amount of trepidation on their part to tell their stories because in the Deep South there was a great fear of the colloquialism old money. So this didn't just, refer to money. It was these families who owned and ran plantations and still retained the political power that they held from that. And they were moving from plantations to the local government and big businesses. So a lot of these stories were not told because this established fear of repercussion. So at another speaking engagement, she ran into a woman, May Louise Walls Miller, who told her she didn't get her freedom until 1962, and that's 2 years before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. 2 years. So her father lost his land by signing a contract that he couldn't read. So it locked him and his family into a land peonage state. So Miller told Harold that she and her mother were routinely raped and beaten by the white men who owned the land. Her father tried to escape once, but he was brought back to the farm and he was savagely beaten in front of his wife and children. So eventually Miller ran away after her father beat her bloody to keep her from being beaten worse by the white owners. And she was rescued by a white family, who then returned to the farm and rescued the rest of her family that night. Harold doesn't believe that Miller's family is the last family to face such a fate in the Deep South. Here's a quote by her. "Do I believe May's family was the last to be freed? No. Slavery will continue to redefine itself for African Americans for years to come. The school-to-prison pipeline and private penitentiaries are just a few of the new ways to guarantee that black people provide free labor for the system at large. However, I also believe there are still African families who are tied to Southern farms in the most antebellum sense of speaking. If we don't investigate and bring to light how slavery quietly continued, it could happen again." Very interesting. So moving on, I looked into the Help because when we think about the 1960s now, it's virtually synonymous with the Help when it comes to the plight of African American women. So this is a true white savior story. It isn't really a story for black women. You can tell that when the movie opens on a woman's white hands. So this is about an aspiring white author during the civil rights movement, and she decides to write a book that details the African American maid's point of view in the white families that they work for and the hardships that they have to go through. So there were several critiques, a lot of backlash for this book because it takes the racial terror out of the 1960s by ignoring the bombing, shootings, and beatings and replacing the Ku Klux Klan and savage white men and mobs with junior leaguers who are mean to their maids. So that was a real issue when it came to the Help because it relieves white people of responsibility almost. This is shown too in when the only person who is beaten in the Help is Minnie, and she's beaten by her black husband. Minnie is a black maid in the book. So this isn't to say that this is not to take away from domestic violence, but there was no acknowledgement of the violence of white people, even though we knew at the time it was outlandish. So in reality, black men were much more likely to experience intimate violence at the hands of white men. In the 1960s, African American domestic workers constantly worried about being raped at work. Mothers would warn their daughters to stay out of their white male employer's way. I think there was a bit of that was shown in the Help. Recently, it was revealed that Rosa Parks was raped at age 18 working in the home of a white neighbor. So since slavery, the rape of black women by white men is as much as a part of perpetuating white supremacy in the South as lynching or segregation. The Help got a few things correct. So nearly 90% of all black women in the South were employed as domestic workers in the 1960s. Wages were terribly poor. Most families were one paycheck from being out on the street. They faced segregation. The Help got it right. There was an uprising of folk who believed that black people could infect them and that they could make them sick because they had different diseases than white people do, which is total bull. But in any case, there was a large move towards having outdoor bathrooms. There's a lot of humiliation tactics. White women, if they upset white women, they could make their lives unworkable. They could label them as a thief. They wouldn't be able to work in the community. So there was a fear of backlash. They were forced to code switch, be who they weren't. This calls to mind Calpurnia from To Kill a Mockingbird. Let's keep in mind also that the Civil Rights Act didn't happen until 1964, and Brown v. Board was only in 1954. So, yeah, I mean, it's disgusting. Here is a photo from the 1960s. that just marks segregation. So the decline of the maid and domestic servant came only in the onset of the Great Depression. People could literally not afford to have servants anymore. So today, nearly 44% of all maids are Hispanic. Maids still make abysmal wages, and they clock in about $20K a year on average. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope you have a wonderful night.